Okay, excellent. So we're here this morning to do our WD workshop. The WD Master's Course Code stands for World Class Discourse. And so in this track, we feature a lot of nonfiction that digs into kind of philosophy, sociology, anthropology, debate topics, and those types of things. And we're going to take a look at the objective first. So kind of based on the idea of sociology and anthropology, we want to explore morality in our society and how that functions. So as I just said, you'll encounter topics like philosophy, psychology. There's a strong focus on kind of like virtue ethics and what that means. And then we have a focus. Oh, sorry, let me stop for 1 second. Are y'all hearing like a strong feedback noise? Why is
I think
that?
it's
Yes.
oh, there you go. They muted, so you're fine now.
Okay, got it. So maybe someone was not muted. Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, guys, that was a bit hectic. Let me go back to the presentation. All right. So we were just checking out that objective. So all of the projects that we'll do in this track are going to focus on research and looking at trends in society and the history of these issues. So the main focus is kind of on theoretical knowledge and how that translates into practice. So here's all of the tracks at a glance. We actually have 5 of the 101 tracks. There was a new one that has been added. So there are 500 level courses. There are 3 200 level courses, and there's 1 300 level course. And I'm going to give a run through of all of these courses in more detail. So when I teach these classes, I've taught probably 4 or 5 of them. Not all of them yet, but the things I like to focus on mainly are current event analysis. And that's because a lot of this is highly cerebral and theoretical. And so we want to ground it in reality to help our students better understand. So I do a lot of like current event focus, issues that are happening right now in Korea or globally, and how we can link those to the class concepts. We're obviously going to analyze the books too and the theses and main ideas that the authors present. In some of the tracks, we'll also do case studies. So we'll choose maybe one patient or one scenario and look at that in more detail. So a lot of kind of like role playing of being like an anthropologist or sociology student and digging into all the details of those different cases. And then the other thing I really like to do is journal-based activities so students can reflect on what these advanced concepts mean to them. Since you've been here with me throughout the week, we've gone over our ST storytelling track and our GL global literature track. Both of those feature a lot more fiction, and I would say they're a lot more subjective in the sense that you can interpret the story and the characters in a wide variety of ways. Now, for WD, I'd say there's more objectivity only because we're presenting things like, Freud and his ideas, or Kant and Kantism. And so it's based on a lot more like kind of facts and theories, which can be subjective, but ultimately there's like an objective type of truth or reality we want the students to arrive to, or a theoretical lens we want them to arrive to. And so I think for me personally, this type of class takes a lot more prep in order to have more effective class discussions. So that's just something to bear in mind. Okay, the other thing to bear in mind is that Korean students are very, very busy. I made a schedule of my student Janie. She's my current debate student who's in the 5th grade, and this is what her weekly schedule looks like. She kindly shared with me her 시간표 that she keeps in her school book. And so this is really to say that when students are not completing their homework, in totality, or maybe they miss a few weeks, I think that it's really important that we keep in mind how busy they really are and how much homework that they have throughout every single week without breaks, right? Because a lot of students go to Hagwon not only on Saturday, but I even have students who go to school on Sunday. or Hagwon on Sunday rather. So that's just to say that we want to be really empathetic with our students, encourage them to complete at least some homework because one is better than none. When we're prepping for our classes, we want to take an approach where the class material becomes accessible for everyone. So even if the student hasn't read yet, or they were on vacation and they were absent and now they're back, or maybe they're a Nishin student, so they've been out for school testing and now they've joined back into the master's class, we want them to be able to participate in some way. So we can do that through additional media, having a lot more personal based questions or scenario based discussion questions on hand. And I also recommend if you've ever taught V1, using some of the strategies that you likely use in that track, which are to do passage, close reading out loud, keeping a running list of the characters, and maybe in this case, the theories or the main plot points that we've gone over, the main scenarios or ethical dilemmas that we've gone over, and have that all noted down either in their computers or paper notebooks, somewhere where they can refer back to it. All right, so we're going to go over all of the WD tracks, starting with WD 101. So this is meant to be an introductory course to the world discourse classes. We have three readers here, three books that are, I think, really appropriately picked for young adults, very YA based, getting things done for teens, How to Be Miserable, and An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. So I really enjoy teaching these three books. I've taught the WD 101 track before, and really it's because of this novel selection. I find that all of these are very like pop sciency, but also geared towards younger readers, specifically getting things done and how to be miserable. It's really just a bunch of different like life lessons and examples of how to live your life. And so the amount of personal discussion you can have with students is just endless because every type of theoretical question can be followed up with, well, what do you think? Is that how you live your life? Why or why not? Okay, so the WD 101 track is a really great introduction. The objectives are ultimately to get students to understand how they function in their daily lives and maybe how they can improve some of their productivity. That's one of the kind of notes here. Then we also want students to take a look at their habits. And so in my classes, we've done habit trackers before and some like bullet journaling type activities to see like what are your positive habits and what are your negative habits? How long does it take to build a habit and those kinds of things. Then we also want students to do a lot of self-reflection. So there's a strong emphasis on self-help and kind of like how you can motivate and inspire your own self. If you're feeling miserable, for example, or depressed, how to get out of that on your own. So very like chicken soup for the teenage soul kind of type of class. And yeah, setting a lot of goals and having plans in mind. So I think this is a really straightforward and interesting class and a great introductory for our students. So this is an example of one of the journal handouts I made for WD 101. So I have these as handouts and I just print them and pass them out, asking my students, what was your productivity today, on a Likert scale? What areas do you feel most productive? Where do you feel that you wish you were more productive? And having them take time in class to actually journal, and then we'll discuss some of their ideas. And I collect these journals and then I don't grade them for things like grammar or accuracy or any of that. I more so just leave personalized comments and like kind of like questions or responses to what they've written in their journals. And this is a really great way to also build rapport in the class and to get to know your students. So this is something you could consider doing for the 101 track. All right, WD 102. This class is based on one book by Michael Sandel that's called What Money Can't Buy. So there are a few Sandel books that we're going to see throughout this track. I'm not sure if you'll recognize the name, but he is a Harvard professor and he's a prolific writer. He has a bunch of these kinds of like guidebooks and handbooks that deal with ethics and moral dilemmas. And so this one is all about the moral limits of economic markets. And so it's an economy-based kind of ethical dilemma where we look at things like when you're fined versus when you owe fees, things like corruption and white collar crime, things like insurance fraud and scandals like that. When things get commercialized and turned into businesses, advertising. So, a lot of themes around the economy. And ultimately, the objective for teaching this class, we want to keep in mind that I think like some of the students might not have that much of a background knowledge on things like the economy. Even for me as a teacher myself, like I'm not always all that tuned into like current markets and what's happening. So I encourage my students to start to try to read like the economy section of the BBC or CBC to like finance section to know what's going on in the news. And I also had to do that myself, just so I was a little bit more up on what's happening. And that helps with the ability to look at the different perspectives that we can take on like markets and like a free market economy. Yeah, so ultimately, students are then going to be able to consider their own personal opinions and how that stands out against the class and the collective, like agreed upon opinion. And what's the morality of that, right? Are you having a immoral decision making, a moral decision making? For example, I like to present ethical dilemmas in this class. One of the ones that we talk about is like, if you knew that nobody was looking and there was no CCTV, would you steal if you knew that you could get away with it, right? Is that something that is appropriate or not? Is that a good economic decision or not? And that kind of thing. So presenting them with different kind of moral thoughts. And that is a way for us to kind of apply the philosophical concepts in a way that's more in context and a setting that the students will hopefully understand and be able to discuss in more detail. So that's 102. We're going to talk about WD 103 and 104 now because they're kind of like companion tracks. So in 103, we have two novels, Freakonomics and The Tipping Point. So Freakonomics is looking at like an economist's perspective on things like nature versus nurture, morality. They dig into like the Ku Klux Klan and discrimination, xenophobia, crime rates, why people join gangs, all these kinds of like economy-based, like I guess it's called Freakonomics because they're like on the fringe or extreme side of participating in the economy in different ways. And then the other novel we have is The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, who's also a professor and a very prolific writer. And he talks about kind of like the minutia, the little details that make a big difference. So for example, still with a economic twist, we have like why epidemics can start, salesmen and the traveling salesman, yeah, smoking and why it was advertised to teens. Yeah, so a lot of different lesson content that has students think critically on yeah, economic topics and moral dilemmas. And the other companion course that takes a similar approach is WD 104. So we have two novels here. We have Sway. This is like more a behavior, kind of like sociology and anthropology based class book, I would say, all about why we behave irrationally or how the NBA draft works and how people behave around things like that. And we have another Malcolm Gladwell story called Outliers, the story of success. Um, and yeah, kind of similar themes you guys can see here in the lesson content. So I won't get redundant, but all of these courses, like so far, as you can see, have nonfiction. So we're digging into a lot of scenarios and real world examples. And so we want to try and always contextualize these for our Korean students as best as possible. So WD 103 and 104, they're both social sciences, behavioral science or social science. And they are going to be focused on the following objectives. So the first one that we want to keep in mind is being able to, again, explore different sides of an issues. So never telling students that there's a right or wrong answer, like in a social science class or philosophy class, there's more than one perspective. And this will help them to think more critically on the issues that are presented and start to become more persuasive. So we do some persuasive essay writing in this track. And then we want to increase their exposure to different issues. So as I mentioned before, for me as an instructor, like I am a lot more into kind of like literature. That's what I did for my undergrad was like English and French lit. And then for my master's degree, I also did some literature. and ESL education. So I don't really have a strong background in these kinds of topics of like behavioral science or the economy. So it was an interesting, I think, like challenge for me to try to prep for these classes. But maybe for some of you, this would be in your wheelhouse. It might be something you've studied in the past in your undergrad or another degree. Maybe by a show of hands, like the topics that we've been looking at so far in the nonfiction, is that something that it would lend itself to you and your teaching style or your interests? Olivia, yeah. Daniel saying yeah. Okay, Tabo as well. Shanna's like, well, maybe. Yeah, for me, I won't lie, it's a bit rough. I'm definitely a lot more of the like creative type, thespian type. And so these classes took a lot more prep effort for me. But yeah, that's just something to keep in mind also when you are talking with your managers about scheduling. I'm curious, at your branch or school, do you guys do like surveys for requesting which tracks you're interested in teaching? Do your managers survey you? Anyone who does a survey? Okay, that's interesting. Mokdong, we get to do that, which is a nice thing that our FM provides us. And so whenever they ask, like, what do you want to teach in the different courses? I always say no to these ones. But yeah, but for some other people, it could be interesting. Okay, and now we're going to look at the last 100 level class, which is WD 105. Okay, so for this class, we have two novels. We have Oliver Sacks' novel, which is A Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And he is a psychologist and scientist who sees patients in his clinic, I guess, and they have all different kinds of psychiatric and behavioral issues. And so each chapter is a different kind of like frame or presentation of a patient. He changes the names of them, right? But the patient's case and why that's happening to the patient. So that's the first book. It is nonfiction. And now we have our first piece of fiction, which is one of my all-time favorite novels. It's Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. Has anyone read this book before? Louise, do you like Flowers for Algernon? Are you a fan?
I actually really enjoyed Flowers for Algernon.
It's like such a beautiful story.
Yeah,
I
and
I
it's
love
so
it
sad
so much.
though.
It's very touching and it's written in a really interesting way because the main character, I mean, I won't spoil it, but the main character goes through some changes. So as the main character changes, the narrative voice and writing style changes as well, which is very interesting. And the kids really enjoy that. It was a super fun read. So 105 is a course I really enjoyed teaching because it has the balance of the nonfiction and then the fiction as well. And I personally really enjoy when the Cheongdam tracks do that. Um, Something to note for 105 is that we start the class with two short stories. We have The Telltale Heart and The Yellow Wallpaper. So The Telltale Heart, I believe, is Edgar Allan Poe. And then The Yellow Wallpaper, I can't remember her name right now, but she's like a famous female kind of horror and like sci-fi writer from the past. I did her during lit school. Shelley, I don't know. Okay, that's fine. Anyways, there's the two short stories that we start with, and then we do The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat for 5 lessons, and we do Flowers for Algernon for 4 lessons, and then the final project. So objectives in 105, this is like a psychology-based class. So we want students to start to understand psychology and neuroscience. So I think with the neuroscience, we obviously want it to be scaled back and more palatable for elementary and middle school level students. And really, we just want to focus, I'd say, on the keyword of introduce. If they don't understand the concepts by the end of the class, of like neurolinguistics, for example, that's fine, but they have an introduction to the concept. And so when they encounter it later in their academic career, they might think, oh yeah, I did that one Cheongdam class where we talked about it and have some kind of background information at least. And all of that information we learn about psychology and neuroscience, we're applying it into the real life cases. So that's really what Oliver Sacks' novel is doing. And then the fictional story of Flowers for Algernon as well, where we dig into the kind of issues and disorders that we deal with in mental health. Okay, so yeah, how to approach those psychological issues. how we did that in the past versus the present and how much we've changed specifically with mental health. As y'all probably know, there's been so many changes that have happened in the past 100 years. People used to just be diagnosed as hysterical and, locked away for the rest of their life or given lobotomies. And so the textbook digs into all that kind of history, the SMART textbook, and then how we have a much more holistic approach to health now and the differences. And then, yeah, we look at neurodiversity, which I really like about this class, because I think that's an important concept for students to be introduced to as they will be attending school and classes with neurodiverse students, and they might be neurodiverse themselves. So it's important that we have empathy and start to create, awareness and destigmatizing these topics. So 105 is a really great track overall for its objectives. When I taught this class, we did an awareness campaign for our final project. One of my students actually has dyslexia, so that's the issue, the mental issue or disorder that they chose for the project. So this was like the poster that they made, and then they had a slideshow presentation that they did surrounding what's dyslexia and what are some interesting facts, why we need to destigmatize it, and there were other slides, and that's the presentation they gave. So it was really great because we were connecting concepts from some ideas we had read in Flowers for Algernon and then making personal connections to the student's own lived experience. Okay, so those are the 100 level classes. And what I'm going to do now is kind of pause and show something else for a moment. Because when I teach WD specifically, I always make sure that I have a chance somewhere in any of the courses to do an essay writing workshop. At our branch, we specifically do it in week 9 in order to kind of get them ready for like day 2 level test of writing essays. That's what we do at Mokdong. But I just wanted to show this to y'all because master's students, although they are at a very high level, right? What I tend to find is one of their weakest areas is in their writing. They still struggle with logical argumentation. They struggle with things like rhetorical devices, using symbolism, using advanced vocabulary, kind of doing the AREL thing, argument and reason, evidence and link. And so I think it would be a nice idea if you are a WD instructor to keep in mind that maybe in one of your lessons, you might want to teach an essay writing workshop. And so what I do is I come up with different prompts that relate to whatever track I'm teaching in the 100 or 200 level. And then we go through really how to start off writing an essay. So, for example, identifying the purpose of the prompt, breaking down the question by looking at its keywords. And I tell students to focus on the verb, like, are you being asked to compare or to describe or to reflect? And what's the difference in those things? So, how would you be writing differently if you're reflecting versus if you're comparing, and kind of getting them primed for that? And then we go over the structure and planning of writing an essay, and talking about how writing an outline can be in a very effective strategy, because what I notice is my students just get the prompt and then just start writing the essay straight away. But if we take the first 5 minutes to brainstorm and then come up with an outline, this can be really beneficial, because what will often happen is the students will be able to have a main argument and they might have some reasons, but what they're lacking is they don't have any evidence. They didn't choose their arguments based on evidence, and so this is where they tend to lose points and the essay ultimately becomes weaker. So if they can brainstorm and outline first, they can choose reasons that will have more evidence. And then we kind of go through the writing process using I statements and strong language. I kind of use this analogy of the blind lady. I describe that I'm the blind lady, I'm confused and I don't know where I'm going. And before we go, you have to start explaining to me exactly where we're going. And once we've departed, you have to make sure I always know where I am because I'm an old lady and I'm blind. And all of that is just to say that throughout the essay, they should have like a really nice organized framework and be explaining to the reader. They don't want the reader to have to make assumptions. They want to kind of over explain. Okay. And then I have always a slide where there's like feedback that I notice. These are common kind of errors or things I would want my students to avoid in their writing. For example, hypotheticals. I see it all the time in essay writing where the students are like, imagine this, and imagine A says this to B, and it's like, it's not an effective way of writing. So let's avoid that, especially at the master's level. Give your personal story or a concrete example instead. How the thesis should introduce whatever's happening in your life or whatever main argument you're making. So this was related back to one of the prompts. Um, and then this is the last point, like answering the question, so what, right? Like if you're making a point, so what? Why should we care about it? Why does it matter, right? What can we learn? What can we apply from this? Yeah, so having students kind of realize that they have to answer this question in addition to the essay question. So that's just a sample of the little workshop I give to students at Mukdong. Other teachers at my branch use this as well, but I thought that that would be like a nice kind of add-on to share with you guys because WD in the 100 and 200 levels do include a lot of writing prompts, essay writing prompts. So I think it's important that we teach the skills. Okay, so let's talk about 200 level. So this class is called Justice, and the first novel we read is Justice by Michael Sandel once again. So we go through that for 7 weeks, and each chapter of the novel that we're reading introduces a different kind of moral philosophy, such as,
Just 1 second.
pardon me?
Um, Hi, it's Anthony. I was wondering if you can share that writing workshop with us after the presentation's over, after the Zoom meeting's over.
Yeah,
Like,
I can totally do
okay,
that. I'll send
thanks.
a link in the chat.
All right, thank you.
No problem. Thanks for your question. Okay, yeah. So the first book is called Justice, and each chapter goes through a different moral philosophy, utilitarianism, Kantism, Aristotle's virtue ethics. So that's what we do in the first part, and we get an introduction to all these different types of moral philosophy, and then we apply them by reading Kurt Vonnegut's Mother Night. So in this story, we have it's a really fun one. We have the main character who's an American who is living in Germany and has been living in Germany for some time. And during World War II, he gets asked to be a spy, like a double agent for the Americans. However, he has a radio show and he's spreading Nazi propaganda in Germany because he's been living there all his life. And then it kind of goes from there where we have a lot of different kind of like double actors and double agents who are representing like two sides of a moral coin. And so we can discuss the morality and the ethical dilemmas that the characters get themselves into, such as crimes against humanity and different prejudices. What benefits the common good by applying the previous principles of justice that we read in Sandel's book. And then we review justice at the lesson 12 and then do our final project. Okay, so this course, much of it is based on Michael Sandel's Justice book. And since he is a Harvard professor, there's also a YouTube series of him lecturing at Harvard and talking about his own book. So the link is in the segment guide. This is actually great. To be honest, for me, I didn't know a lot about Kantism and virtue ethics and utilitarianism. I knew the basics, but in order to teach it, I wanted to become better educated myself. So I watched his YouTube series and I quite enjoyed it. So that would be a tip from me, is to take advantage of what's online and watch those YouTube videos. And so the purpose here is to challenge our students to kind of think about those moral dilemmas and topics. But of course, the content is very, very advanced. Like, again, we probably can all have a similar experience where we didn't learn about moral philosophy and utilitarianism or libertarianism until high school, if not college. And again, we're doing this with like elementary and middle school students. So keep in mind that it's going to be very, very challenging, right? The content is challenging. So ideally, this should be experienced master students who have hopefully done all those 100 level tracks. But if that's not the case, we really want to make sure we find ways to make this more accessible to students. Yeah, so I think the prep side of these 200 level classes requires that we try to, put ourselves in our students' shoes and think about how the philosophical side could relate to them. Okay. So one more thing I should note is in addition to justice, for every week that we read justice, there is a short story reading as well. So we read about utilitarianism and then we read Ursula Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And we read libertarianism and we read the short story Harrison Bergeron. So the short stories, the fiction, always reflects whatever the justice novel main principle was. So that's one more thing. These short stories get assigned for homework as well. And we start the class talking about the short story and then how they relate to the philosophical concepts. Okay. So when I taught this class, something I found to be very helpful was to set up motifs. So obviously the theme of the class is justice and moral philosophy. We're going to hit that theme over the head every single week, right? But just like we do in V1 with themes and motifs, I think we can do this in any master's class. And this is specifically what I did in my justice class, was set up motifs and controversies. So the first one that I introduced to students in week 1 is the notion of something in theory versus something in practice. And what's the difference between these two things? And theory and practice was a discussion point that we kept coming back to week after week. Another one was utilitarianism versus libertarianism, just because those two philosophies are so, there's so much tension between the two of them. And then that was really helpful because it meant by the end of the semester, every one of my students could at least talk about those two philosophical theories. They knew what utilitarianism was and they knew what libertarianism was because I kept bringing it up in every scenario and every personal discussion. And the final one I used was morals versus our desires. And what are the conflicts between those two things? And so with these controversies and motifs, it meant that all of my class conversations could have building blocks that I would relate back to. And when we finished reading Justice, I could read Mother Night with the students and take the fictional plot points and relate it back to these motifs and controversies. Okay, so I think lesson prepping like this, something I've learned as a master's instructor over the years is that I think I've mentioned this before, but the week by week prep can get really tricky if you're only prepping one lesson at a time. And I know that it's obviously a very big responsibility to have to prep out many lessons ahead of time. Cheongdam, the way it's set up is that we usually just get to prep one lesson at a time. But if you think of other educators, other teachers in different contexts, they take a whole month, right, to plan out 6 months at a time or what their year at a glance is going to look like. And so if you are the kind of person who's motivated to do that, I think that's excellent. If you could, sit down on a Sunday afternoon and take the afternoon and evening to open up the textbook lessons and at least break down a little bit of a term plan for yourself. That way you're walking in with more knowledge of what's happening in the class, and the discussions and the students' understanding is just going to be that much higher quality. Okay, so I'll show you a few projects that we did in that class as well, just so y'all can get some ideas. So in my justice class, what I did was for one of the projects, we did a choose your own adventure storytelling. So Kelly, my student, chose World War III, which was happening in 2041. And she wrote her story. You're the president, and you're asked if you agree with starting the war or not. What's your opinion? Option 1, option 2. And so these links take you like a choose your own adventure. Yes, I agree. And now here's what happens in the story, right? And you keep choosing your options and going through the story, which leads you down different pathways. This was a really fun project. The students loved it. And personally, for me growing up, I loved reading choose your own adventure stories. So this could be a cool project that you could do that kind of blends creative writing with making moral choices and philosophical choices. It kind of merges the two together. And for the final project of the class, this is what I put together. The students had to make a social campaign about polarization in Korea and some kind of fragmentation in society. So let's see. Yeah, they needed to choose one issue and provide background information on the issue, and then give an opening speech that was memorized. They needed to use at least 3 pieces of media to show that they have some media literacy and consider if the media, what kind of tone it took and if it was trustworthy or not. And then provide a conclusion on, in their final analysis, what they want the future of Korea to look like. And then they made poster boards, and we did a poster fair with the other classes that were teaching the same track. And they made one poster board about one of the philosophers and their theories that we had during the class. So I gave an example of some social issues in Korea that they might want to pick. For example, an aging population, overeducation, the low birth rate, but they also could have a topic of their choice. Yeah, and so we ran this project over a variety of weeks, and in week 13 did the final presentations with their campaigns. We went to the other classes and did like a science fair, like a philosophy fair, and did like a poster board tour, and then we gave each other peer feedback. So that's an example of how you can put together like a final project for any of the WD classes really as well. Okay, so WD 202, this track is all about mortality and the meaning of life. This track has been revised, and I'm also really excited about this track because I was the developer. I got to write these lessons. So since I've given y'all my email, if anyone gets to teach this one, I would love to hear your personal feedback, because as I said, it's new, it's just launching. The first one we read is The Five People You Meet in Heaven by Mitch Albom. And then we read When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi, and Into the Wild, which is John Krakauer, I think. Yes, John Krakauer, which is about the story of Chris McCandless. You might be familiar with this. If you're a 90s baby, this was like really popular in the 90s. Chris McCandless walks out into the kind of wilderness in Alaska, and we don't know why he does that, but he ends up dead. And so we're confronting mortality in all of these stories. They're all excellent picks. This one is a great young adult novel. This one, Paul Kalanithi, is much more advanced because he's like a surgeon, but he did his undergrad in literature at an Ivy League school. And so because in his undergrad he was doing, literature, he's a fantastic writer, but he uses very advanced vocabulary. So that's one thing to keep in mind about this story. And then this is just some kind of like straight up journalism style. So very easy to read, but a little bit dense. So the objective for this class is to examine what life and death really means from different perspectives. That's kind of the main objective, and the theme for the class is mortality and how to make meaning from that. Okay, and then we want students to be able to express what they think and what their experiences are, and then use that as inspiration for their projects and their writing. Now, something that's really important to note with a track like this, really with any kind of these upper level Cheongdam tracks, I would say Injustice 2, the Mother Night novel by Vonnegut, has really sensitive content, but specifically this track on mortality has a lot of sensitive content and graphic content, including like assisted suicide, yeah, like kind of body gore and horror, and there's some stuff that goes on in these novels that is graphic. So please warn your students and set the tone of the seriousness of the issue so that we can avoid any kind of complaints. And so again, if this is getting scheduled, I really do feel it has to be with the higher level master's students who have taken many courses in the past, so that they have a really strong understanding of what the master's program is about, and that they're more responsible as students. And while personal opinions are very important to a class like this, we want to make sure that we don't overstep and make any moral judgments about what students think about the meaning of life. Students will have different religious backgrounds. Students will have different experiences with if they've encountered death in their lives or not yet. And we also don't want to scare them, you know, depending on their age. That's the other thing. So please treat everything kind of very sensitively and with caution. I would rather everyone err on the edge of caution and kind of limiting discussions rather than diving too deep and upsetting a student. The other thing is if we're using like comic relief, please do so appropriately because I know these kinds of like kind of like gory or morbid topics can sometimes be used like in humor. But because students are using their second language, we don't want them to misunderstand what's happening. So that's just an important note. Okay, the last 200 class is 203, which is called Hardcore History, and it's based on Dan Carlin's novel The End is Always Near. It's also based on his podcast called Hardcore History. So we go through European history and we look at Alexander the Great, the Bronze Age, the Gilded Age, bubonic plague, nuclear warfare, all those kinds of things that have happened throughout history. The objective here is to gain a historical perspective, of course, because it's hardcore history, and how that kind of relates to modernity, and then, yeah, to relate it to real world issues and scenarios. Okay. So this class does have a podcast. And so the author, Dan Carlin, the book we're going to read, we're also going to listen to his podcast. The podcast episodes have been clipped to make them more manageable for students to do their homework. So from week 1, the students have to start listening to the podcasts at home and they're embedded in the smart textbook. So what I'm actually going to do is show everyone what that looks like because I know at my branch we had some confusion around like how to assign these podcasts and like for which week and for when. And so since I'm doing the workshop, I want everyone to be able to have a chance to avoid what we went through at my branch. So I'm just going to show you the textbook now. Okay, so when you go to the first lesson for this 203 track, we have the scout page, the dive page, the explore page, and project pages, which is something I touched on yesterday. But the podcast to be assigned for homework is always on the last page of the smart textbook. So what I would do in week 1 is make sure you go to this page and tell students like, look, when you go home and you go to your learning portal, this is your homework. You need to go to page 10 of the smart textbook and you need to listen to this at home. The podcast is embedded.
It's history.
So they're going to listen to the podcast and do a summary of the episode and answer these questions in their paper notebooks. And then come back. And when we come back in week 2, we're able to review the podcast notes and talk about on the Scout page, kind of like a review of what happened in the podcast. Okay. So just to avoid confusion there, because I myself got confused and so did our other instructors. So I thought I would point that out. Okay. All right, then let me hop back here. Okay, the last class I'm going to talk about is the 300 level class. So 301, we're reading Carl Sagan, actually, which is very interesting, the Cosmos novel that he wrote. There's a foreword by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and then we're reading Yuval Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. So this is a very advanced class, which is why it's 300. Personally, at Mokdong, we've never taught this track because I would say it's geared for middle school, 3rd grade, or high school students. I mean, the fact that they're reading Carl Sagan is just like a dead giveaway, right? I think this was way too much for elementary level students. But if you do have older master students that you'll be teaching, perhaps you'll be doing 301. So we go back and forth reading Cosmos and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And sometimes we read from both. And then we talk about human evolution, natural selection, artificial selection, how we can reimagine Earth, how we might immigrate to Mars, missions to Mars, post-truth societies, secularism, science fiction, terrorism. There's a bunch of different themes in here that are very advanced. And then there are 3 term projects that we do. So rather than doing a final project, we do term projects for each part. So here, the objective is to build a cosmic perspective, right? To understand our role in the cosmos, and understand internationally how we'll all feel differently about that. So there's a strong emphasis on themes of space, technology, math, and science, and how those help us with problem solving, and how we could address today's challenges through those themes. It's a very theoretical class. So theory versus practice, I think that comes up a lot while teaching this. But yeah, just understanding humans as a species and what our role is on planet Earth. Again, I think in order to have proper discussions, the students should be a little bit older. Yes, so that's the 301 track. And there's a note in the SEG guide that says exactly that. It's an extremely challenging course. They likely will struggle. Okay, so we want instructors to willingly prepare and engage, and find ways to make it relatable. But I think as I spoke to all of y'all yesterday, nobody currently has high school students at their branch, or those older level master's students. So I think it's doubtful that we'll be teaching this in next semester, but if it ever does occur, you'll have a recording of this workshop to kind of refer back to. Okay, so overall, here are some notes on just teaching the WD classes overall. I recommend using small groups and pairs as often as possible. That way we can emphasize peer-to-peer learning. Use cold calling just as you would to have them read out instructions and questions. We can also have students write answers to discussion questions versus doing it verbally and having oral discussions. And we want to challenge students to construct their opinions and push them as much as possible because they are master's students. So we want them to really develop constructive skepticism and all of that great logical reasoning. So I spoke on this yesterday. You can prep in terms of units of what you're reading or in terms of themes. I think that's up to you. I personally like to prep in terms of units, but other teachers I work with do theme-based prep for overarching themes. You can consider making a Google Drive for your class as a modification. Always lesson prep to your students' needs, and be realistic about what they need from you. And some modifications for project can be making handouts or making group projects rather than individual projects. And always keeping in mind that we're either building towards a final project or that we're doing term projects throughout. So we need a strong framework and structure. Here are some resources that might be helpful for you moving forward that you can check out. And with that, are there any questions? I'm going to link in the chat that essay writing workshop. Let me make sure everybody can view. Viewer.
I just had like one final question.
Absolutely.
So with our branch, we have like pretty much new master students who are kind of like not exactly the level they should be for masters. What would be
Okay.
2 classes that you recommend for people, like for students who are struggling?
In terms of WD or in terms of any of the ones we've met about?
Any of the ones we covered throughout the
Okay,
last 3
excellent.
weeks.
So if you have low-level students who are struggling, I'm going to tell you that WD 101 is a really easy, straightforward class. I would recommend that one. ST 101 as well, because that is the coming of age literature. We read The Giver. The Giver is a story that I personally read in like the 4th or 5th grade, right? That was appropriate for my age. And so I think it'll be appropriate for these students. And then in terms of GL, maybe I'm thinking of GL 101. Wait a second, y'all. GL 101 might be let me just make sure. Because GL 101 might be the coming of age literature. I've been doing these workshops all week, so I'm getting a bit out of sorts here, but let me confirm for you. Okay.
No worries.
So GL 101 is coming of age literature. So I would recommend that one. And I definitely recommend WD 101, which is the motivation type class. And then if I can make a recommendation for ST, Okay, I'm going to recommend ST 103 because that's the visual literacy. And the great thing is that the first book is just all about like color, shape, movement, and the second book is a graphic novel. So I think reading the graphic novel should also be more interesting and fun and at the level for the students. Yes. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, so